Assalamu alaikum. Our first speaker is a British-American writer who has a bachelor's degree in psychology from Manchester University and a master's from Hebrew University of Jerusalem. She has authored a number of books, including After the Prophet, which is on sale in the back. She has written on the Middle East for numerous publications, including the New York Times, the New York Review of Books, Harper's, The Nation, and the New Republic. Her work mainly focuses on the intersection of politics, religion, and history in the Middle East. Without further ado, I'd like to welcome Lesley Hazleton to the podium.
Okay, come on, who's the culprit with the cell phone? First, of course, thank you so much to the organizers for inviting me today, especially in such extraordinarily distinguished company, I'm afraid. I think they were wise to start off with me, since the level can only get higher as the afternoon goes on. Their knowledge, of course, of Islam is infinitely greater than mine. I mean, infinitely greater. Inviting me here is all the more unusual in that I really am an outsider looking in at Islam. And as I understand it, the purpose of my invitation was indeed to be that outsider, to give a different perspective. So please bear that in mind as I talk. I am here as an agnostic, though an agnostic with a deep sense of religious mystery. No affinity for organized religion, which is probably partly due to the fact that I was the only Jew in a Catholic convent school as a kid. I'm here as a writer who's explored the early history of Christianity in a book I wrote on Mary, the mother of Jesus, Nana, who has explored the early history of Judaism in a book I wrote about Jezebel, the Phoenician princess who was married to the king of Israel at the time, Ahab, and who has explored the early history of Islam. Rather superficially, I'm still afraid, with After the Prophet, which is about what happened after the death of the Prophet and the matter of, quote-unquote, the succession. But throughout, what's fascinated me has been this vast arena where politics and religion overlap, where they jostle against each other and with each other, the way they do this. I'm here also as a psychologist, rather a nervous one obviously, since I have to take a drink of water right now. Psychology is my original academic field, as you heard, trying to figure out the dynamics of what happened. What really happened and what is happening now. But every time, whether as agnostic, or as writer, or as psychologist, I'm always asking questions. In the case of After the Prophet, the question came up after the terrible day of the attacks in Karbala on Ashura in the year 2004. And the question was, of course, how did this happen? How did it come to this? How did this begin? And that's what led me back to the 7th century and led me to discover this amazing narrative that I retell in Western form for non-Muslims in After the Prophet. Now, in this age of instant information, where somebody is actually capable of holding up a BlackBerry and saying, all the information in the world is here in this little thing, totally mistaking or totally confusing the word information with the word knowledge. Two very, very different things. In this age of instant information, the answer to that question I asked is usually told in a nutshell. When I say nutshell, think of maybe a pecan nut or a hazelnut. It'd be nice and shiny on the outside. And the trouble with nutshells, you know, the nutshell of After the Prophet is a kind of dismissive, oh, it was a dispute over who would succeed Mohammad. And that's it. I get it. Let's move on. And of course, when you get that kind of nutshell, all you get is this glossy, nice shell. And you forget that you're not getting the nut at all. There's no meat in it. It's an empty shell. No meat, no substance, no sustenance, no indication of the depth and the power of the story of what happened and of the intensity and the tragedy of it. Just the empty shell. Now, I call this the nutshell syndrome. And for a writer like me, it's a wonderful situation because there's so much to write about and so much to discover and so much to tell. But it's also, to tell you the truth, quite dismaying. And I am dismayed that I have this opportunity because it depends on how very little non-Muslims know about Islam. And modern media, of course, loves nutshells. And the interviewers keep on asking me, well, you know, can you just give us a quick outline of what happened? That's all we want. Depth is the enemy of much of modern media, especially when it comes to electronic media. And as a result, inevitably, what makes the news, what makes it into the media is an extraordinary collection, as you know, of stereotypes, gross simplifications, assumptions, all bedeviled by the long, very long shadow of Orientalism, the even longer one of just plain prejudice, and the relatively new one of 9/11, and all fueled by easy slogans like the clash of civilizations. So despite so much talk about Islam, there's a lot of talk about Islam, and most of it is pretty ignorant. And just how little is known was made clear to me once again just a few days ago in New York City at a dinner party given by a very nice couple, intelligent. He's a lawyer, she's a designer. He's Jewish, she's Catholic, and neither of them remotely observant. And they asked me, and their guests asked me what I was working on, and I began to talk about the Quran, which I've been reading recently. I'll tell you in a bit more detail in a moment, and what was in it. And I realized that there was this absolute astonishment around the table as I told them how many times the stories of Abraham and Moses and Joseph and Jesus are told in the Quran, as well as the stories of David, Solomon, Noah, and Lot, and many others. It was all news to them. They turned off the music even. Everybody leaned in and sort of listened intensely, you know, like I was bringing some kind of great news to them. And let me make clear, these were all well-meaning, good, liberal people, relatively well-read. Yet not one of them, and there were no Muslims among them, not one of them had any awareness of the Quran as the Quran itself says, both a confirmation and a renewal of the Torah and the Gospels. There was zero awareness that what is commonly called Judeo-Christian values here in the United States is actually Judeo-Christo-Islamic values. Now, it's easy then to say, okay, well, they should read the Quran. And in fact, there was one person there who had tried to read the Quran and given up in utter confusion. Of course they should read the Quran. But the point is, it's easy to say, and as I'm sure you know, it's very, very difficult to do well, especially in translation. So for the past several weeks, nobody's been able to eat at my house because my dining room table has been full. I've been doing this very slow, very close reading of the Quran, checking several translations, including Arbery, Dawood, Bakhtiyar, and Abdullah Yusuf Ali, against both the transliteration and the original Arabic, starting with the transliteration and then reaching for a really good dictionary. This is, of course, a very poor substitute for mastery of Quranic Arabic and reading it directly, but this is what I am capable of. One works with what one has. So, of course, I've read the Quran, quote-unquote, read the Quran in translation before. At least I thought I had. But it's only now, after this really close reading, that I even begin to appreciate why Arbery used the word interpretation rather than translation, and why it is so often said that the Quran can really only be appreciated or grasped in the original Arabic. It's a demanding book. To even begin to read it well demands a love for and appreciation of traditional Arabic rhetoric and poetry, as well as a certain familiarity with the history, with the social and political events of the time, with what it refers to. And above all, it demands patience and it demands respect. And this makes it a very difficult book to read in the usual Western sense of reading. It's certainly obviously not the kind of book you're going to settle down with on a rainy afternoon, you know, with a bowl of popcorn within reach and so on. It demands a completely different attitude towards reading. And it's not a matter of verbal translation. It's not even a matter of cultural translation. As I see it, what's needed is a completely different frame of mind than the one Western readers usually bring to this matter of reading. And of course, for us, the difficulty is compounded by the fact that the Quran really is impossible to translate well. You can translate it functionally, and the translations, the ones I've been working with in any case, vary immensely. And some are more influenced by the style of the King James Bible, some more prosaic. All are occasionally brilliant, but more often mundane. And none of them, of course, come anywhere near the cadence and the majesty of the actual Arabic. So it's far easier, I can see this, to just give up. And instead of actually reading the Quran, to cite the Quran. And indeed, like the Bible, the Quran is constantly cited. And as with the Bible, the citations are highly selective. Now, I don't know about you, but sometimes I'm tempted to think that evangelical Christians have only ever read one book of the Bible, and that's the last book of the New Testament, Revelation. And sometimes I could almost imagine that most Islamic extremists and their critics, the non-Muslim anti-Islamists, their most fervent critics, seem to know only one surah of the Quran, and that's Repentance, the 9th surah, with the so-called sword verses. And Saeed Naqshbandi, I know, is going to be talking about this, but there's an Orientalist misnomer right there, of course, since the word sword never appears at all in the Quran. And of course, they have no idea of the historical circumstances that the surah refers to. But selective citing from the Quran means that a verse that appears once is quoted endlessly, out of context, while verses saying the contrary, verses that appear literally dozens of times, are never, ever cited. And by the way, as regards contradiction in holy writings, I just have to refer you to the first 2 chapters of Genesis, which are mutually contradictory about how man and woman were created. And it doesn't ever seem to bother most Christians or most Jews. The people at this dinner party were amazed when I told them that they could read all the way through the Quran, searching for the now infamous definition of paradise as 72 versions. And of course not finding it. That in fact the word huri appears, or at least I've so far found it, only once in the original Arabic, and that it's been translated several different ways, most of them highly influenced by Orientalism and its sexualized stereotypes. Whole phrases are added in, like maidens with swelling breasts and so on. You look in the Arabic, sorry, where are those swelling breasts? It's not there. And, you know, each time that happens, I want to call, I really miss Edward Said all the more these days. I mean, I just want to keep on calling him up and say, I found another more Orientalism.
Nare takbir! Allahu Akbar! Nare takbir! Allahu Akbar! Takbir! Allahu Akbar! Nare Risalah! Ya Rasulullah!
So these people were amazed at this dinner party when I told them that by contrast, paradise is defined literally dozens of times in the Quran as gardens watered by running streams. Now, I live in the Pacific Northwest. So, you know, it's just wonderful. For me, that really resonates. And I've also lived in the desert. And anyone who's ever lived in a desert country will appreciate where this idea, this image of paradise comes from. And that a huri, well, there are people here who are much more expert than I, but so far as I can make out as of now, it's most likely not some seductive teenage male fantasy, but a woman believer who has been granted eternal youth in paradise. And that the idea of 72 virgins, and I'm sure there's many people here who will correct me because I may very well be wrong here, appears to have come some 300 years later and is generally considered a rather weak hadith. And in fact, there is one scholar who said that the image of 72 virgins in paradise is actually on a par with that kind of Hallmark card New Yorker image of a Christian heaven where everybody sits on clouds and has sprouted wings and is strung clouds. The ease with which this kind of myth-making happens is not just a matter of ignorance, and it's not just a matter of the nutshell syndrome. It seems that most of the little non-Muslims know about Islam is based on selective Quranic citation and interpretation by extremist fundamentalists. It's passed on by non-Muslim anti-Islamists who repeat it and think that all Muslims will cite these as the Quran, and of course repeat it unthinkingly in the media. Modern media is not exactly known, as I say, for depth of thought. And this process of distortion is made all the easier when the political climate encourages it, because it has done in this country, obviously, since 9/11, leading inevitably to easy paradigms and slogans such as Islam versus the West, which is an astonishing juxtaposition given that so many Westerners are Muslim. And, of course, the other infamous one, the clash of civilizations. Now, in fact, what we face is not a clash of civilizations. It is, as I see it, a clash of religions. And by this I do not mean Islam versus Judaism or Islam versus Christianity. I mean fundamentalist religion versus mainstream religion. These are terms that I'm a little bit uncomfortable with. The word fundamentalism, there are approximations. The word fundamentalism seems to imply that the fundamentalists have some grasp of the fundamentals of their religion, which I'm not sure is true. And I keep on trying, sort of looking for better words. You know, are we talking about human religion versus inhuman religion, religion of hate versus religion of love, cruel versus kind, extremist versus moderate, closed versus open, democratic versus authoritarian. Anyone here in this special period has ideas for a better phrasing, we would really, really appreciate that, because for lack of a better term right now, I really have no option but to keep on using the word fundamentalist. So, bear that in mind, please. As I see it, fundamentalist religion, despite all the heat it generates, is utterly cold. It has no soul. It is soulless. It entirely misses the spirit, the poetry, the essence of the religious experience. It's mechanistic. It is rote. It's either or, with us or against us. It is, in fact, the world and the heavens in black and white. Nothing in between.
Very good. Excellent.
Fundamentalism is unreasoning, unblinking, undoubting, which is why it demands not faith. It has absolutely no room for that, what I consider that utterly admirable leap of faith that Soren Kierkegaard talked about, nor for real Islam, willing acceptance. But instead it's a kind of desperate, absolute belief, an insistence on certainty for a personality deeply threatened by uncertainty. Now one can understand the growing attraction of such extremism in an increasingly uncertain world, even as one is appalled by how it's based on the most literal possible meaning of the Bible or the Quran, blind to context, blind to history, blind to culture, to metaphor, to the spirit, and above all blind to ethics. But what's at issue here, again this is as I see it, is the distortion of the whole idea of religion, whereby the smallest but the most extreme minority can always be used to represent the whole, and of course always claims to represent the whole. Which is how come the so-called new atheists, Dennett and Dawkins, Hitchens and Harris, define all religion by its extreme fundamentalist minority. Of course, by so doing, they only end up as dogmatic and unthinking as the stereotype of religion that they themselves have created. For instance, I, as a Jew, have nothing in common with the violently messianic Jewish settlers in the West Bank of Palestine who seem to think that Palestinians are disposable.
Allahu Akbar! Allahu Akbar! Allahu Akbar! Ya Rasulullah! Nare Salwan! Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad.
Well, thank you, but this is really not a matter for either congratulations or applause. I am totally appalled by these people. These settlers are my shame as a Jew. They are my Taliban. And their claim to represent the Jewish people. Their claim to represent the Am, the Jewish people, the Jewish equivalent of the Ummah, not only insults me, but it also insults both the spirit and the essence of Judaism as I see it, while their claim to represent God is quite simply obscene. These are the real co-religionists, as I see it. The fundamentalist extremists of all religions are co-religions. They're brothers in arms. They're literally blood brothers. Fundamentalism, you could say, is a separate religion, all on its own, containing Christians, containing Jews, and containing Muslims. Now, I know that most people here, in fact, I think probably everybody here is aware of the 600-page fatwa on suicide bombing and terrorism issued by Sheikh Tahir al-Qadri on March 1st of this year. There's an English language summary online at minhajuk.org. And yet, despite its detail and close argument, or maybe given the nutshell syndrome, because of its detail and close argument, it's hardly been covered in the United States media. Now, I know that Dr. al-Qadri is by no means the first Muslim scholar to pronounce terrorism as haram, against both the letter and the spirit of the Quran and Hadith, but so far as I know, and again, any correction is welcome, he is the first to denounce it as anti-Islamic, and to do so with such a palpable sense of outrage. Not only are suicide bombing and terrorism against civilians condemned by Islam, he says, but they're totally beyond the bounds of Islam. That is, they are the acts of unbelievers. Terrorism, he says, and here I quote, is not only unlawful and forbidden in Islam, but also represents the rejection of the faith.
Well said. That's good.
He notes very carefully that from the outside, on the most superficial level, Islamic terrorists, and I would add, like their Jewish and Christian counterparts, Islamic terrorists appear more pious than others. They, and again I quote Dr. al-Qadri, they invoke Islam and raise slogans to establish the divine order, but all of their actions and steps constitute a clear violation of Islamic teachings. Now, these same invocations of divine order are all too familiar in the most infamous parts of our shared history. They were used to justify the Catholic Inquisition in Spain. The expulsion first of the Jews in 1492, and then of the Muslims in 1609. They have also, despite the Prophet's ideal of unity, been used by Muslims against Muslims. Starting with the Khawarij, who assassinated Ali, Mohammed's cousin and son-in-law, the first Imam of the Shia faith, the last of the rightly guided caliphs in Sunnism. In fact, Dr. al-Qadri calls today's Islamic bombers and suicides the Khariji of our time. And this especially resonated with me since I had written about the Khariji in After the Prophet. And I'd like to read you just a couple of pages from that right now. I don't know how familiar you are with this history, but this was after the Battle of Siffin, when Muawiyah, who Dr. Naqshbandi has written his thesis on, and I'm so looking forward to reading this book. Muawiyah, the governor of Syria, had challenged Ali for the caliphate. And Ali had led the army up from Iraq, from Kufa to Sifin, which is now in part of Syria, northern Syria. And the two armies had faced off there. And in fact, Ali's army was on the verge of winning when Muawiyah's general suggested a ruse to put an end to the fighting. He suggested, and Muawiyah agreed, that his cavalry put parchment pages of the Quran on the tips of their lances and ride into the field of battle with this way, saying, the great Quranic quote, "Judgment belongs to God alone, put down your weapons, we will figure this out from the Quran, and we will settle the matter this way." It was, so far as I can make out, the first time the Quran was used as a political weapon. And many of Ali's followers, seeing the parchment pages of the Quran, said, no, we cannot fight anymore, and laid down their weapons, despite Ali's warning them that it was just a trick, just a ruse. And then they turned against him. The very people who had laid down their weapons and demanded that he stop fighting in the name of the Quran, then accused him of agreeing to arbitration with Muawiyah and thus giving men authority over the book of God. And they said to him, so your deeds are worthless and you are lost. This is what they said to Ali, the extremists among his own followers. You have given men authority over the book of God, and so your deeds are worthless and you are lost. The role of Caliph could not be arbitrated, they shouted. The succession to the messenger of God was a matter of divine right. That right had been Ali's, but he had now forfeited it. He was as guilty as Muawiyah of transgressing divine law. There was no difference between the two. Both were equally abhorrent in the eyes of God. And again they shouted out the slogan that was to become their rallying cry. The quote from the Quran. Judgment belongs to God alone, they cried, to God alone. Those words are true, Ali countered, but you twist them and use them to mean something false. It was they who had insisted that he agree to arbitration at Siffin, he said. They'd ignored his warning then. How could they now attack him for doing what they had insisted on? But there's nobody as righteous or as blind to reason as the reformed sinner. When we wanted arbitration, their leader replied, we sinned and became unbelievers, but we have repented. If you now do the same, we will be with you, but if you will not, then as the Quran says, we reject you without distinction. As the rest of the mosque rose up in uproar over the very idea of Ali as a traitor to Islam, Wahab, it's a rather an evocative name, was the leader of the Khawarijis, declared that the whole of Kufa was mired in a state of Jahiliyyah, the pagan darkness that had reigned before the advent of Islam. Let us go out, my brothers, he said, from this place of wicked people. And go out they did, some 3,000 strong. 50 miles north of Kufa, they established a new settlement on the Tigris, which was to be a haven of purity, a beacon of righteousness in a corrupt world. He and his men were to be the first Islamic fundamentalists. They called themselves the rejectionists, Khariji, meaning those who go out, with reference to the Quranic phrase, those who go forth to serve God's cause. They had seen the light and repented. And with the absolutism of the newly penitent, they devoted themselves to the letter of the Quran and to the exclusion of its spirit. We are holier than thou, they were saying, to Ali, purer than the pure. And as is the way with such righteousness, they took their zeal for purity over the brink into all-out fanaticism. Anything that fell short of their standard of faith was nothing less than apostasy and had to be ruthlessly rooted out lest it contaminate the righteous. They began to terrorize the countryside around their settlement, submitting everyone they caught to a kind of mini-inquisition. And if the answers failed to satisfy their rigid standards, the punishment was death. Matters came to a head when they chose the farmer's son of an earlier companion of the prophets as their victim. A number of them had ridden into his village for supplies and decided to make an example of him. And when he stood up to them, as they closed in around him, he took a brave last stand. Ali knows far more of God than you do, he said. And with this he sealed his fate. Ali was an apostate in rejectionist eyes, and anyone who submitted to the rule of an apostate was himself guilty of apostasy and his life forfeit. They leaped on the farmer, tied him up, and dragged him, together with his pregnant wife, beneath the heavily laden date palms of an orchard next to the river. The details of what happened next are tellingly precise. At one point, a date fell to the ground. And one of the Kharijis picked it up and put it in his mouth. "You do that without the owner's permission and without paying for it?" said the leader of the band. "Spit it out." Then another began to swing his sword in threatening circles, and by chance hit a cow that had wandered behind him and killed it. And at this, the others insisted he go find the owner and pay him the animal's full value. They waited while he did so. And then, having acted with the utmost righteousness in the matter of both the date and the cow, they meted out due punishment. They made the farmer kneel and watch as they disemboweled his wife, cut out the unborn infant, and ran it through with a sword. Then they cut off the farmer's head. And justice thus upheld, the date spit out, the cow paid for, the farmer and his wife butchered. They purchased their supplies and went on their way. And they did so with the clearest of consciences. Even the murder of the wife and unborn child, they maintained, was called for by God, since women and children of the enemy shared in the sin of their male kin. There were no innocents. And in this, the 7th century extremists set the pattern for their descendants. Today's Islamic terrorists, to go back to Sheikh Tahir al-Qadri, like the Kharijis, distort, twist, and confuse the entire Islamic concept of jihad. This is a quote from al-Qadri, which is exactly what Ali himself said to Wahab, the head of the Khariji. "Your words are true, but you twist them and use them to mean something false." The Quran returns again and again, as you note, that line adopted so obscenely by these extremists. The same line shouted out loud as one of them slashed at Imam Ali with his knife 4 years later, killing him. "Judgment belongs to God alone, not to humans." So the ghastly irony is that while these extremists were so adamantly quoting the Quran, they were at the same time denying it by insisting that they had the right to judge for God. They were acting, that is, as though they were God. Now, in religious terms, I believe this is called heresy. In non-religious terms, it is certainly the most stunning arrogance, which, as you know, is a quality that the Quran repeatedly warns against. And in fact, the rigidity of mind and inhumanity of action displayed by both 7th and 21st century extremists are the exact opposite of the social justice, egalitarianism, humility, and ethical behavior advocated by the Old Testament prophets, by Jesus, and of course by Muhammad. I find it hard to imagine that the Prophet Muhammad himself would be anything but utterly repelled and dismayed by what has been said and what is still being said and done by terrorists and extremists in his name and in the name of God. Just as I find it hard to imagine that Jesus would be anything but repelled by the distortions of Christianity preached by those who claim to act in his name and in that of the same God. Because both men want a message of forgiveness. Now, not long ago, I heard a wonderful definition of forgiveness, one that combines wisdom with humor and insight with humanity. This is how it goes. Forgiveness is abandoning all hope of a perfect past. Abandoning all hope of a perfect past. And it seems to me as a psychologist that there's a lot contained in that word perfect. that it's the searching for perfection that is so problematic. Why is it so hard to accept that we are human and messy and imperfect? Our sages knew. Thus the tradition of Middle Eastern carpet makers who weave in a deliberate flaw because perfection belongs to God alone. Thus the Orthodox Jewish thing, leaving, when you paint a room, you leave a little space unpainted. You deliberately leave a flaw because perfection belongs to God alone. In fact, judgment belongs to God alone. It might also be rendered as perfection belongs to God alone. Perfection is transcendent. It's beyond the human, which makes it, in the most literal sense, inhuman. Not for humans. Beyond human. Now, the Quran, as you know, says humans are the most contentious of all beings. But perhaps we could be less so if more of us could not only abandon all hope of a perfect past, but also let go of the idea of a perfect future. That is, if more of us were to adopt what I understand as a more Sufi way of seeing things, which is to strive for perfection in the full knowledge that it is unattainable, an impossible ideal beyond the reach of human beings. So, as against the black and white digital way of being in the world of absolutes, of either or, I would pose the recognition that between pure black and pure white, there are an infinite number of shades of grey, and that this is where we live. Or to put it another way, we live between the two poles, the North Pole and the South Pole, not at the poles, for the very good reason that human life at the North Pole and the South Pole is impossible. And this, to me, is what religion, or the religion I appreciate and sense, the religious experience, what I admire as religion is really about. It's not about aspiring to be God. It's aspiring to be fully human. Thank you.